Varieties of prose: descriptive prose, narrative prose, expository prose.
In ordinary prose, the aim is to communicate one's thoughts and feelings. What is important then is what one wants to say, and how one chooses to say it. What is said is the topic or subject of the composition. How it is said is the style or manner in which the topic is expressed. The style greatly depends upon who we are writing for, and what sort of personality we have. There are different topics and different styles. Whatever the number of topics, they all come under one or another variety of prose, and each variety may have a distinct style of its own. What then are the different varieties of prose? For purposes of analysis, we have categorized them as descriptive, narrative, and expository. But these three are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes you find more than one variety in a piece of work. It depends on the skill and intention of the writer. For example, in a novel or short story, we are likely to find all these varieties of prose work together in interesting and innovative combinations.
Descriptive prose.
Descriptive writing describes things as they are or as they appear to be. It can be the description of a person or a landscape or an event.
In descriptive writing, we are able to see things as they are or were seen or heard or imagined by the describer. A good description translates the writer's observation into vivid details, and creates an atmosphere of its own. Through his or her description, the author tries to recreate what he or she has seen or imagined. A fine description is a painting in words. Here is a description of Mr. Squeers in Charles Dickens' Nicholas Nickleby, 1838–39.
Mr. Squeers' appearance was not prepossessing. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favor of two. The eye he had was unquestionably useful, but decidedly not ornamental, being of a greenish grey, and in shape resembling the fanlight of a street door. The blank side of his face was much wrinkled and puckered up, which gave him a very sinister appearance, especially when he smiled, at which times his expression bordered closely on the villainous. His hair was very flat and shiny, save at the ends, where it was brushed stiffly up from a low protruding forehead, which assorted well with his harsh voice and coarse manner. He was about 2 or 53, and a trifle below the middle size. He wore a white neckerchief with long ends, and a suit of scholastic black. But his coat sleeves being a great deal too long, and his trousers a great deal too short, he appeared ill at ease in his clothes, and as if he were in a perpetual state of astonishment at finding himself so respectable.
This is a graphic description of the appearance of Mr. Squeers. The details are so sharp that we can easily visualize the person. We are told about his height, his eye, his face, hair, forehead and dress. A successful description, it enables us to picture the person vividly. It is also a very enjoyable passage. Did you notice the irony in, he had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs in favor of two? The eye is further likened to the fanlight of a street door, a very interesting and unusual analogy. You must also have noticed how carefully Dickens chooses his words so that we can see the hair that was very flat and shiny, hear his harsh voice, and so on. These then are some of the devices that you will find used effectively in literary prose. Here is another descriptive passage.
Ishtiaq Ali is a thin man of medium height. He looks older than his age. He is about 50. Even after a long service, his salary remains meager. An unlettered man, his family expanded in a big way, he has 9 children.
Does this delight us in the same way that the previous passage did? Perhaps not. Although it certainly does give us some information about Ishtiaq Ali. Where is the difference? It is in the use of language.
Here the language is purely functional with bald statements aimed at providing information rather than delight. In the earlier passage, it is a pleasure to read the sentences again and again, savoring their suggestiveness. As we have seen, successful description makes you visualize the scene or the person. Generally, description is not an independent form of writing, that is, a whole book will not consist of descriptions alone. It is often used as an aid to narrative or expository writing. Its main purpose is to describe a sense impression or a mood. Narrative prose. A narrative tells us what happens or happened. It deals mainly with events. In other words, a narrative is a description of events. It may deal with external or internal events. By internal events, we mean the thoughts, feelings and emotions of individuals. Narrative writing tries to recreate an actual experience, or an imaginary one, in a way that we are able to experience it mentally. We lose ourselves in the characters and events of the narrative temporarily. Narratives can deal with the facts or fiction. Autobiographies, biographies, letters, travelogues, diaries and speeches are narratives of fact. The short story and novel come under the category of narrative fiction. In a narrative, we are carried along the stream of action. When we narrate a story, we concentrate on the sequence of events. It is the action that grips the attention of the reader. Narration is concerned with action and actors. It may make use of description, but description is secondary. Action, characters and setting are the elements that are woven into a pattern to make the narrative interesting. Rudyard Kipling mentioned the ingredients of a narrative in the following verse. I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I know. Their names are what, and why, and when, and how, and where, and who. What happens? Why does it happen? When does it happen? How does it happen? Where does it happen and to whom does it happen? All these questions are answered satisfactorily in a narrative. What makes a narrative interesting is not just what is said, but the way it is said. In short, what we wish to point out is that narrative writing makes use of narration as well as description. In order to dramatize the situation, dialogues and conversations are introduced, so that the writer is able to recreate the situation and communicate the experience.
Sambo of the bandy legs slammed the carriage door on his young weeping mistress. He sprang up behind the carriage. Stop! Cried Miss Jemima, rushing to the gate with a parcel. It's some sandwiches, my dear, said she to Amelia. You may be hungry, you know. And Becky Sharp, here's a book for you that my sister, that is, Johnson's dictionary, you know. You must not leave us without that. Goodbye. Drive on, coachman, God bless you. And the kind creature retreated into the garden, overcome with emotions. But, lo! And just as the coach drove off, Miss Sharp put her pale face out of the window, and actually flung the book back into the garden.
Expository prose. Expository writing deals in definition, explanation or interpretation. It includes writing on science, law, philosophy, technology, political science, history and literary criticism. Exposition is a form of logical presentation. Its primary object is to explain and clarify. It presents details concretely and exactly. Expository writing is writing that explains, but we are not interested in writing that merely explains. We are interested in expository writing that can be read as literature.
Structure. Prose lacks the more formal metrical structure of verse that can be found in traditional poetry. Prose comprises full grammatical sentences, which then constitute paragraphs while overlooking aesthetic appeal, whereas poetry typically involves a metrical and/or rhyming scheme. Some works of prose contain traces of metrical structure, or versification, and a conscious blend of the two literature formats, known as prose poetry. Verse is considered to be more systematic or formulaic, whereas prose is the most reflective of ordinary, often conversational, speech. On this point, Samuel Taylor Coleridge jokingly requested that novice poets should know the definitions of prose and poetry. That is, prose, words in their best order; poetry, the best words in their best order.
Prose. Most everyday writing is in prose form. Poetry. Poetry is typically reserved for expressing something special in an artistic way. Prose. The language of prose is typically straightforward without much decoration. Poetry. The language of poetry tends to be more expressive or decorated, with comparisons, rhyme, and rhythm contributing to a different sound and feel. Prose. Ideas are contained in sentences that are arranged into paragraphs. Poetry. Ideas are contained in lines that may or may not be sentences. Lines are arranged in stanzas. Prose. There are no line breaks. Sentences run to the right margin. Poetry. Poetry uses line breaks for various reasons, to follow a formatted rhythm or to emphasize an idea. Lines can run extremely long or be as short as one word or letter. Prose. The first word of each sentence is capitalized. Poetry. Traditionally, the first letter of every line is capitalized, but many modern poets choose not to follow this rule strictly. Prose. Prose looks like large blocks of words. Poetry. The shape of poetry can vary depending on line length and the intent of the poet.